Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And this is a continuation of our short two-part series on generational theory. Now, in the last episode, we discussed the foundation of generational theory, which is sort of the context of what's going on. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the actual generations themselves. Now, as we go through, I just want to make a note. In order to diagnose which generation you're in, I want to give the time periods. We're going to introduce them slowly, first talking about their archetypal energies, and then we'll talk about how we're experiencing, like the specific generations that we are experiencing with these energies. That'll make sense in a moment. But in order to diagnose or discover, rather, which generation you fall in, I just want to give a couple of dates. If you are born, I'm going to look at them really quick because I don't remember the specific dates without having a cheat sheet. But if you,
I think that's allowed.
I think that's allowed. If you're born between 1943 and 1960, that is the baby boom generation. If you're born between 1961 and 1981, that is Gen X, right? Or what is also called the 13th generation. If you're born between 1982 and 2004, that is millennial. And if you're born 2005 to present, that would be what we know as Gen Z right now. And so as we go through and talk about these archetypal energies, and as we talk about the specific generations themselves, that's approximately the age range. And we're also going to probably touch on the generations that come before, like the artist generation. So if you're thinking about anybody who was born, or not the artist, rather, the silent generation, it's like 1925 to 1942. We'll also reference like the greatest generation, most likely. That would be 1925 to 1942. And if you're interested in the generations that come even before that, you can look up on Wikipedia generational theory. That will give a full list of these.
Those dates are a little off. I think 1925 to 1940 is not the greatest
1942?
generation. That wouldn't be when the greatest generation was born.
The silent generation.
That was the silent, yeah, just to make sure. So what did you say for the silent? You had said a date?
1925 to 1942 was the silent generation.
Correct.
And then, the greatest generation, my apologies, is 1901 to 1924.
Yeah, just want to make sure we got that accurately so people are following like, wait, that's the same date range.
Thank you for the catch. I really appreciate it.
So we've talked about then the cyclum idea, and there's these 4 seasons, roughly about 20 years each: spring, summer, autumn, winter, and then they cycle again every roughly 80 years, and these energies come online. Now let's talk about the actual generations. Those you said that there's. I mean, I know this too. I'm teeing you up so we can have this dialogue. We've talked about there's these 4 archetypical generations that cycle through. Let's talk about that next.
Okay, so right. So the saculum and the seasons are the context. And then the archetypal generations are the people who are born in each of these contexts. So the people who are born are the generation that is born in spring, in the time period of renewal and a high, are the what's called the prophet generation. And our version of the prophet generation are baby boomers. That's our prophets, right, that are alive right now. Prophet generations are generations who are, well, first of all, they're dominant. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there are more of them than other generations, although often that is the case because they are born in a high, right? They're born during a time period where...
abundance.
It's abundance. That's right. And prophet generations end up being a dominant culture even as children. And so they're used to being paid attention to. They're used to having influence. They're used to showing up and people giving them some credibility and credence just because they exist. And in part, it's because they were born right after a secular crisis. So they get paid attention to. These are the children that we want to take all of these learnings from the previous saculum, and we want to make sure that they're raised right. And so if you look at baby boomer generation, or specifically that generation, there's a lot of I don't know, like just things that were built for them, right? Things that indicated that they were paying attention to children during that time period. Previous generations, kids, like you threw them a broom and they got to go crawl up a chimney and, sort of rake it out in previous generations. At this point, national parks start to be created for, or not national parks, but city and town parks are now being fashioned for children to be able to play on them. Disney World and Disneyland, well, Disneyland specifically actually was created during the time period of the baby boomers, and that concept of a Disney dad was created during that time period. There was a lot more children's programming that ended up becoming a big deal because that was, that they were all sort of trying to raise children right. And so the Mickey Mouse Club was a big deal during that time period in the wide world of Disney. And it just became this sort of culture where children were important, they were paid attention to. And even though they weren't coddled necessarily, I wouldn't say that boomers were coddled, they were still given a lot of weight and importance.
Prioritized. Very prioritized.
Exactly.
And so that expectation, it carries with them into their life. Like, I think that my generation should be prioritized. We're important. And they were probably one of the first generations, too, that got a media label, like the baby boomers. I'm sure there were other labels, but in a mass media way, because television came on right around the time that these boomers were starting to be born. I mean, boomers in the television set, like broadcast television, pretty much were born in the same 10 to 20 year span. Like, that was the technology that they rose with.
Right.
And so that influenced their culture a lot. And I think a lot of boomer culture was influenced by the television and television broadcasting.
Right. So then boomers end up coming of age, that's when they come of age, is that time period of spring, which is a high. And then they go into young adulthood, right? They're now entering their 20-somethings, teens and 20-somethings during a spiritual awakening. And that's really why they get called prophets, is they become a force to be reckoned with, a cultural force to be reckoned with during a time period of spiritual awakening. And so they're the ones who were on the campuses talking about how, Vietnam wasn't okay. A lot of them were those who supported civil rights movements. There was a huge group of young people who were going to make their presence known and make their voice known during all of these, like, what kind of people do we want to be time periods. And so they end up becoming not just children who are used to being given some credence or credibility or some weight. These are important children. We have to make sure that they're okay. Then they became 20-somethings, teenagers and 20-somethings that were a voice that others were listening to. And so now we look back, there's a lot of statements around how boomers are, narcissists, or they only pay attention to themselves, or they only care about their own thing. But they're used to people paying attention to them. That's part of, it's almost like a rite of passage for them, or not a rite of passage, but more like a birthright. That's actually closer to what I was looking for, is like this idea that for boomers, it's a birthright that people pay attention to them. And prophet generations of every single version and iteration in times past have had the same quality. There's this idea that when they speak, others will pay attention and to some extent organize around them to make it so that their wishes are carried out. And they get followed by a generation that does that for them. And so even when they are now in their midlife, they enter midlife during fall and autumn, which is an unraveling, right? It starts to unravel, but it's also a time period of a lot of abundance. And the sad thing about boomers or prophet generations is that they end up becoming elderly during winter. So the beginning is all good news. Towards the end, now when they're starting to sort of, their influence is starting to close up. That's a time period of scarcity. That's a time period where now we're reevaluating the entire saculum. So this saculum, which in some ways is their saculum, right? They were born at the beginning of it. They experienced the entire thing. And now when we're starting to close up shop on that saculum, there are many things that were just the way reality worked that are no longer rules that they can count on. And so in some ways it starts out really great and it kind of ends in a way that's, like why isn't everybody paying attention still? And to some extent, boomers, I mean, if you notice, even especially in politics, man, they have an almost
overrepresented,
surprising representation for people that are, later on in life in those positions.
Yeah. So this prophet generation then, speaking things forth, getting into late life, later adulthood, like elderlyhood during winter. My first statement when we started this podcast was, older generations, older people want to preserve their past, what's come before. And I can imagine I can just imagine how desperate that's got to feel when all the good stuff's in the past. And right now it feels like stuff is not as good. And I mean, it may not be bad, but it just doesn't feel as good. It doesn't like, there's a lot of feeling stuff coming in here for each generation. And so there's a grasping and trying to preserve what came before, a reset. No, we've got to go back to these values. This is what is the thing that's important. And that prophet voice that they had in their young adulthood isn't working the same way. They're hoping that they speak forth something in a prophet way and say, this is how we've got to be. And it doesn't feel like everybody's listening anymore. And so I think it causes things like holding on to power in positions in like politics and leadership and some of those things, like in executive branches in certain companies, because they're trying to preserve what once was. And it's really hard to let that go. And I'm sure that's a really difficult thing for many boomers to face.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can sympathize. I really can. I mean, it's got to be difficult to, I think particularly the prophet generation right now, the boomers, they're also experiencing something that I don't know if previous prophet generations had to experience, which is the ending of one just unquestioning paradigm or way of looking at reality into another one, which is very destabilizing. And that's leaving modernism for postmodernism.
Yeah. That
happened during autumn, right? That was part of the unraveling, is that we're bridging modernism into postmodernism. And when you're raised in a modernist world, there are some things you just take for granted. You just take a modernist perspective for granted.
Yeah.
And the idea that postmodernism became a dominant paradigm during fall, and then now it's definitely here to stay in winter. In fact, it's going to be a major thing that is fought over in the next saculum, who gets to set the tone of how we see reality. And in a postmodernist, sort of landscape, it's like a game of hungry, hungry hippo who's going to get the most marbles. And you can see that right now. Everybody's smacking those little hippo paddles as fast as they can to try to get as much influence as possible to push it into the next saculum, regardless of whether or not they're conscious or aware of it at all. You can tell it's almost like we're trying to establish what's the next 80 years going to look like. What's going to be the high, right? In the last version, like you said, Red Scare was there. There was like, that was the time period where they start putting 10 commandments in all the schools and in the buildings, like official government buildings.
You're talking about when the prophet generation was little kids in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. The previous generations are trying to put a lot of things in this new spring saculum that's starting up.
That's right. And there's a version of that coming up for us, right? Who gets to be the quote unquote 10 commandments in City Hall, right? So as this generation is sort of completing its cycle of influence, how much of the modern world that they believe should be preserved is going to be able to be pushed into the next saculum?
Yeah.
And that's a big question mark. We don't know.
So the archetypical prophet generation is born during spring. So let's talk about the generation that's born during the high point of summer, during the spiritual awakening, the generation that's born here.
Right. Most of the, and there's not a perfect cut. Like it's not always 20 years for each season. It's not always a 20-year span for a generation to be born in. So there's like a little bit of, lip on either side. It's not it's messy, right? All life is messy, and models are going to reflect that. But the generation that is generally born approximately during summer, that time of spiritual high, or excuse me, not spiritual high, but spiritual awakening, is what's called the Nomad generation. And nomads are, we know them in this cycle as Gen Xers. So that would be us. And Gen Xers or nomads are, because they are children during a time period of spiritual awakening and come of age or enter early adulthood during that time period of unraveling, they end up being a neglected generation. In fact, they're recessive. Yeah. And that's not in numbers. That's not in population. It's in influence.
Yeah.
So Gen Xers, as a recessive generation, they were generally, and the cycle holds true from all previous versions of nomads, is that they are generally considered people who have to take care of themselves, and in fact are to some extent demonized right? They get in the way of navel gazing. These children get in the way of the ambitions of the previous generations that are trying to figure out what kind of people we want to be during the spiritual awakening.
Yeah, it's hard to have space for children when you're on a crusade. Like, they can maybe come on your ride, but can you go make mac and cheese for yourself? Because I've got something important I'm working on over here, is the message I think a lot of kids were given in that generation, the Nomad generation.
Right. Nomads are when the concept of latchkey kids became not just a phrase, but like a phenomena. Most Gen Xers, and that's why they're called nomads, they end up not really having a sense of self. They don't really have a sense of, they have a sense of self, but they don't have a sense of home usually. They're the ones who are letting themselves in. They're the ones who are figuring things out on their own. They're not necessarily a super creative in an artistic way generation, but they're usually very creative in how they figure out how things get done.
Technically creative generation.
Exactly. And that's why they're called nomads, because they end up, I think the phrase is they take their tools with them, right? Nomads take their tools with them wherever they go. So they tend to be very technologically savvy. They tend to be a gadgetry generation because they're always trying to figure out how to work things and make things happen. And they, as a general rule, are quiet in sort of cultural influence, but they are massive in how they make things happen underneath on a foundational level. So the prophets that are used to sort of speaking out their will and wishes on the world, it's almost always the next generation of the nomads that make it happen for them. So sometimes prophet generations don't even know how things work, right? They don't, or on a technological level, they don't know how when they spoke something out, it just organized around them. They just know what happened. And Gen Xers tend to be, or nomads rather, tend to be really competent and capable, right? They are not necessarily influential in a way where they go, this is how we think the world should be. They're influential in sort of creating a foundation for the world, and everything gets built on top of those platforms.
So because they're nomads, this generation archetypically, the energy it's nomadic, it moves around, it's free form, it's independent, doesn't need to be plugged into a system. And it, because of that, births almost this hacker culture of hacking together systems to make them work. Like, the goal is not to have an ideal like the prophets and speak for some ideal. It's to create practicality of this has to work. Mm-hmm. And so in order to make it work, the energy says, I might have to hack around the system that is to make something that can actually produce a result. And so, I mean, you can see in the name that we chose as our company, how much of a Gen X ethos is baked into the way we approach even personality types and all of these models. We see ourselves as people who are nomadic, independent, and hack things together to make them practical in the world.
Yeah. We tend not to, even though there are some of us obviously very much in right now in the limelight in this way, we tend to not choose politics as our way of influence. We tend to choose industry as a general rule. And you can see that the people who are some of the most influential business owners are of the Gen X generation.
Yeah.
And so those are the platforms that are built. Now, not all of them, right? But as a general rule, that is the case.
Yeah, they're leaving media. They're leaving like kind of collective media ideas, academic ideas, and government, and moving into private business and independent business often.
As a general rule. And particularly with Gen Xers, I mean, we were too young for this, but we're also at the tail end of Gen X. We're some of the youngest Xers. The mid and older Xers, I mean, they watched the North American culture collectively lose faith in politics in one of the most shocking events at the time, which was a sitting president resigning on national television. They got to watch that as little kids.
Richard Nixon, 1973.
Exactly.
During the Watergate scandal.
Yeah. And so there was not a lot of, I mean, they didn't grow up. They didn't come of age in a time period where people were like, government will save us. They grew up in a time period where it was like, is government going to collapse? And so there's not a lot of faith that they have in those kinds of institutions. Now, not to say that they don't still, there's plenty of Gen Xers represented in government. It is a place of influence and power. Individuals might be very attracted to it. But as a general rule, it's not where they hang all of their faith, right? And usually when they get into politics, they almost take a reluctant hero role. They're like, I guess I have to do this because things are breaking. And I guess in order to fix them, I'm going to have to get into this game. And so there's not like a desire for it as much as there would be in other generations. There's I guess this is what has to happen.
Yeah.
So they come of age during the spiritual awakening. They hit young adulthood during an unraveling, and then they hit midlife in winter. And so it's the can-do attitude, right? It's the, I guess we're going to have to fix this attitude of Gen Xers that oftentimes help the entire culture get through winter. Now, not always, right? There are some very negative things that come along with being a nomad. One of them is the massive independent streak, which makes it so that you don't play well with others very well. It's hard to play well with others. The other thing is that there tends to be a cynicism and a meanness to the generation. Like
Harsh.
There's a harshness to Gen Xers or to nomads because they were kind of treated harshly themselves when they were kids.
Yeah.
Like I always find it very funny that just not even 10 or 15 years before, when the boomers were children, there were all of these really lovely movies and resources that came out for children. And then during the time period of Gen Xers, it was like Children of the Corn and The Omen and Rosemary's Baby. And like there's all these movies and TV shows that made children the villains. And then almost like it was set to a clock. As soon as millennials came around, which of course is the next generation, it's like baby on board signs are there, and
3 Men and a Baby.
3 Men and a Baby, and
It's like back to good stuff.
My Girl, and like children are back to being the good guys. But before that, during the time period of Gen Xers, it was like, no, you're Damien from The Omen, you child that is in the way of my spiritual awakening. So there's a harshness to Xers, and people don't always like it, but there's a candor to it. There's a get it done attitude. There's I guess I have to figure it out. But there's also a winner takes all mentality among this generation, which means that this is the generation where like some of us are literally the wealthiest people on the planet, and some of us are, we never really got out of the trailer park. And I say this as somebody who was raised in a trailer park, by the way. It's like, that's the schism of this generation. It's very winner takes all. And it's harsh that way. Like there's a harshness to Xers that it's hard to overcome.
Well, and it certainly explains why the Xer, kind of the middle-aged culture, is baffled at the sensitivity of everybody these days, especially young people, where, we're trying to create more understanding and compassion, but we're like, really? That's triggering, that's upsetting? Like that's not even a tenth of what I had to deal with as a kid or as a young person. And that doesn't excuse it. I'm just saying, like, I think our generation, the nomad generation, Xers in particular, really struggle with why people are so easily offended or triggered or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting though is I've also found Gen Xers to be some of the harshest in their support and white knighting of people's sensitivities. Does it make sense?
Well, maybe because of the trauma that was faced as children, young adults.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're the ones who also like put forward this idea of needing really high quality food, right? Because we're all raised on mac and cheese. Like we let ourselves into the house with a latchkey, and then we made ourselves mac and cheese, right? Every afternoon. Yeah, and ate Doritos and drank soda, right? And then all of a sudden it was like, it became really important to make sure that like high quality food is everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's a reaction against how you're raised. And I think in some ways the harshness made it so that there is a certain subset of Gen Xers that very much protect and almost white knight sensitivities, but they're very mean about it. They're not very forgiving of people who come against them. Even the people who would be called quote unquote right side of history people, if they're Xers, they're kind of dicks about it.
Yeah.
And that's just that harshness of the generation.
Yeah, I think you'll see Xers putting infrastructure and, like you said, industry in place to accommodate what their ideals are. Whether you agree with them or not, they're not just trying to speak forth their ideals. They're trying to create them. So I think Howard Schultz, he might be a boomer. I don't know. But not the founder, but one of the founder of the modern day Starbucks created this idea of a third place, a place to meet outside the home. It wasn't a private place. It wasn't a public place. It was kind of this personal third place. It was kind of an ideal. Whether he was an Xer or not, that's kind of an Xer ethos. John Mackey, I think it's his name, that founded Whole Foods, That's a very Gen X ethos. Again, I don't know if he's an Xer or not of that generation, but it's
Yeah.
like, let's make it so you can go get the food that we say is important. Like, let's create the infrastructure for it.
I think they might be boomers, but I think they're late boomers.
Young
like,
boomers.
Yeah. They're at the very end of boomer. That said, I think that the best place to see this is actually in the digital realm and platforms that were created online. Like the Google guys are definitely Xers.
Google guys, I think all of those Yahoo, Google, all those early tech companies, even some tech companies now, and now all those people are venture capitalists funding the next round of investment of technology.
Exactly. Yeah. So you really see these platforms in a digital space, and that I believe is one of the biggest thumbprints of Xers is the virtual and the digital platforms that they created. That infrastructure is very influenced by the can-do, get it done, make it happen hacker ethos of Xers.
Yeah. We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. So let's talk about the next generational archetype. So we've got the prophets who were born in spring. They come of age. There's abundance. There's that spiritual awakening in summer that they go into in their young adulthood. And then during their young adulthood, the Nomad archetype energy is born in summer, the season of summer. Now we get into autumn, and the energy that's born here is yet another dominant energy. It's not recessive or diminished like the Nomads are. This is a more prevalent or prominent generational energy.
Right. Yeah. It's highly influential. And this is the archetypal energy of the hero. So unsurprisingly, the hero generation is what we call millennials. And so millennials are born during an unraveling. And a
harvest.
And a harvest, right, exactly.
So a lot of abundance.
Abundance and the ability to pay attention to children, but at the same time, a big question mark about how it's all going to pan out culturally, right? Yeah. And so the heroes, the reason why they become heroes archetypically is because they enter young adulthood during winter. So they're born in autumn, but they enter young adulthood in winter. And winter is that time period of secular crisis. So who gets us through a crisis? Well, usually secular crisis is war, oftentimes, physical war. And who fights the wars? Heroes do. Heroes go fight wars. And so who do we throw at war? Young people, right? We throw people who are not little kids and not middle age. We throw young adults into war, into battle. And so this archetypal energy of the hero is required. So during an unraveling time period, like you said, it's also a time period of harvest and abundance. And unlike that spiritual awakening, this time period now goes back to paying attention to children. It goes back to believing that they're important and that we should be giving them some credence.
Yeah,
we end up creating a sense of, because our institutions have been reevaluated, because we have reevaluated the kind of people we want to be during the spiritual awakening, and we want to make sure that these ideals are very much carried out and carried forth, then we tell the hero generation as little kids, it's your job to save the world. You are our heroes, okay? We've figured out who we want to be during a spiritual awakening, and it's up to you, little kids, to make it happen. And this is part what prophets do. They speak out their ideals. They speak out how they believe the world should be. And so they tell the prophets oftentimes tell an entire generation of young burgeoning heroes, you are heroes and it is your job to save the world.
Yeah, and this is the message many young adults got as children. It's your job to save the environment. It's your job to save social things. It's all up to you, and you've got a big job ahead of you. And that puts a lot of pressure on our generation, quite frankly.
It's kind of horrible when you think about it.
Yeah.
Every generation has its own stuff. You know, Gen Xers, the sad thing is that they were all told that they were little demon children and they had to let themselves in the house. But in some ways, this idea that like all of you have to band together and save the world, I mean, the pressure is outrageous.
Yeah.
And you can tell that there's a whole generation of people who are, millennials, who are still in young adulthood, but now pushing into midlife, right? The oldest of the millennials are now starting to push into midlife. The youngest of them are still in young adulthood. But this age range of people who believed it was their job to save the world, well, of course you're going to look for a battle because you're told that was what you were made for, is battles. You're heroes, so go fight battles. And you can see a generation of people who are looking for battles to fight.
Now, just as a side note, the word millennial, the label for this generation, actually was coined by Strauss and Howe in their book Millennials Rising. And I remember my dad had it on his coffee table when I was like in the late 1990s, and seeing that book, maybe it was the early 2000s, it was somewhere like over 20 years ago. I saw this book and I flipped through it even at the time. There are a lot of predictive things about what we're seeing now with this generation. And just imagine a generation that's prepared to save the world. It's almost a battle-ready generation. Like grab your weapons, whatever those are, metaphorically speaking. Prepare for battle because you're going to have to fight to make sure we're all going to be okay. And so what happens to a generation that's preparing for war that may not naturally come? One could argue that generation is potentially going to create that. It's going to find it even where it's not there.
Yeah.
And I think some of the things that we might be dealing with in our world today could be an archetypical generational pattern being played out of, I don't know where the war is, I don't know what to do, and that creates anxiety if there's nothing to put that hero attention to. Maybe I should create some disturbance. I need to create the drama to have the war, quote, unquote, to be able to handle the archetypical energy that I have inside of me.
Well, and it's also to some extent, and this is why I think these generations blame previous generations, not inappropriately, that to some extent they also are in that space because there was marching orders. Like prophet generations speak out their ideals. This is what we figured out about who we want to be during our spiritual awakening. And now we're going to, groom an entire generation of people who will go fight this battle for us. And so in some ways it's a marching orders scenario. And it's older people who start these battles, right? It's not the millennials. They're primed and ready to go get into whatever fray because they feel like that's what they were told their job to do, was to do, is save the world. So how do I save the world? And it's older generations that go, you save it in these ways. And both boomers and Xers have certain things that they think should be the case, right? That like, this is how the world is supposed to be. So make it so, right? And Xers are a little bit more likely, like these nomads are more likely to try to go handle it themselves, but they're independent. The hero generations are a little bit more collectivist, right? They get together. They go, we're going to go fight as brothers in arms together. And so there's a little bit more, and that's one of the generational schisms, is that millennials and Xers very much clash, butt heads on this. Do we have a more collectivist view or do we have a more independent view? And again, because life is a paradox, both. You need both of them, and you need them in equal measure, and you need them both represented.
So it's just a kind of anecdotal, but interesting. Look in the last 15, 20 years, some of the most popular movies that have been coming out, they've all been movies around heroes. So superhero movies, like Marvel and DC comic movies. Like Marvel movies have just been taken off. Like they're just huge. Now I think they're diminishing now. But this generation, as it's exiting childhood and entering young adulthood, messages of hero are just blasted at this generation. Interestingly, right? It's almost, you can just feel the archetypical energy just swirling around this generation. They're just being fed these messages of hero, go save, hero, go save. And so again, we're seeing this. And the last time we saw this, a hero generation, archetypical hero generation, was the greatest generation, born in the early 1900s, who ended up fighting the majority of World War II. For the United States and all the world, this generation together was fighting this war in Europe and in the South Pacific. And it was a global conflict, and this generation rose to the occasion as young adults to say, we'll do the hard stuff. We'll ration the food. We'll do what it takes. We'll tie our yellow ribbons around trees. We'll do whatever it takes to get through this. We'll plant our victory gardens, and we're going to make this victory happen. And all sides were probably feeling this way, but I'm coming from an American-centric viewpoint, obviously, as an American. And so that hero generation, they feel like they won that global conflict, that total war conflict. And now, okay, we can rest and now we can go into spring.
Yeah. I mean, they were called the greatest generation for a reason, right? They went through a lot of hardship. And that was after them surviving the 1930s, which was after the economic crash, right? And of 1929. So there was a lot of reasons to call that generation the greatest generation.
Yeah.
But that was the previous version of the heroes. And so millennials are now taking that space, and there are going to be stories in the future told about this time period, right? Where those are going to be the hero stories of the future. And so there's a reason why they are a hero generation, because we need them during the secular crisis. We need that energy wanting to fight and get us through. Now, again, it's the nomads that usually architect our way out on a infrastructural level, but it's the hero ethos, right, that keeps us galvanized to get through to the other side of winter. So you really need both those generational energies. And then they end up becoming, they enter midlife during the high, right? They'll enter midlife during spring, and they'll be very influential in how that looks, how spring looks, what are the values of the next saculum. They're going to be very influential in crafting that.
And you can see in the 1950s how rigid and collective the last hero generation was. There was not a lot of dissent, at least in American culture. In the 1950s, you were on board with one way of doing things. Now, postmodernism might inject some differences here in the next cycle of this. But I would argue that the hero generation now, millennials, they have some rigidity in, like, you fit this narrative, this framework, or you're out. Like, you're either in this or you're out of this. And that was a very prevalent viewpoint in the 1950s. And I think the high watermark of it was the McCarthy trials in Congress, the Red Scare, and just canceling writers in Hollywood and all these people that had dissenting views. We talk about cancel culture. There was cancel culture then, like, people were losing their jobs and had to flee the country kind of cancel culture, going to jail cancel culture. Like, it was actually way more extreme than now. But that's that generational's energy, is kind of a sense of, like, you're either in with us or you're out away from us.
Right.
And that's going to be an interesting challenge to see as we get through this quote unquote total war time period, however that plays out, and we enter into spring. How much is that going to rise up? How much is everything going to kind of get coalesced into one way of seeing it? And it's like an in-group think kind of frame.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's not just that the energy of the generation, it's also the time period of winter.
Of course.
It's like it's the archetypal energy influenced by the time period in history in which they're
absolutely.
Yeah.
So you ready to move on to the next archetypal energy? Okay. So we've got spring, where the prophets are born. And then we've got summer, the nomad generational archetype energy is born. Autumn and fall, the hero generation is born. And now we're actually in winter right now, according to generational theory. So we're in the middle of winter, and we've been here probably for a few years, maybe a decade.
Moving on a couple decades, I think.
Yeah, I think we're coming into our well into our second decade of a winter. And again, these aren't like at midnight on this date, it like clicks and it's all of a sudden winter. It's just like real seasons. It's hard to tell when autumn ends and when winter begins experientially. Now, we know the equinox of the sun, but experientially it kind of just blends into the next one. Mm-hmm. So it's been a slow dial up into winter. We're in the middle of this. Who's being born? What archetypal energy is coming online and being born right now?
So the fourth and final archetypal energy are the artists. And right now they're represented by Gen Z, what's called Gen Z. Now, in generational theory, Gen X isn't called Gen X. They're called the 13th generation. And in generational theory, Gen Z isn't called Gen Z. They're called Homelanders. And the reason why they called them the Homelander generation is because they started being born right after 9/11, where Homeland Security was a dominant influence on the scene. It changed basically the cultural landscape of the United States, or of North America, effectively. And so there's a generation that started to be born, I think 2005-ish is when generational theory starts. Homelanders, or what we call Gen Zs, 2004, 2005, which is a bit later than others, by the way. Millennial generations are very, very short and small according to a lot of other generation demographic information. They put them in like 82, 83 to the late 90s, which is like 15 years, which is very, very short. They're a 20-year span for generational theory. Millennials are. And so they go from like 82-ish to like 2003, I'd say. Something around 2003, 2004. So millennials are very like kind of a long generation. And so according to generational theory, Gen Z, or what they would call homelanders, they're like 18 now, right? They're still in their coming of age. They're still children, effectively. And they'll start moving into young adulthood, or into adulthood soon, young adulthood. But they are the ones who are born during a secular crisis. And so artist generation children, because they're born during a secular crisis, like the nomads, they end up being ignored. Now, nomads were ignored for navel gazing, but artists are ignored because there is legit crisis happening. And so this generation ends up being not just a generation that is kind of ignored, they're a generation that is also expected to be very compliant, right? This is a time period of war. You need to listen to me. You need to obey. You need to get in line. We all need to band together.
Yeah.
So they also have a bit of a collectivist, like, let's all band together feel. And they also tend to be compliant. They tend to be obedient children. Now, if somebody is of this generation right now, especially if they're a teenager, they're not going to be like, I'm a compliant, obedient child. They might not identify with that. But there's a sense of, what does the world need right now? What does it need of me? And I'll show up doing that because I know that we're in a crisis time period. I know that life is hard. I know that it's really tough on everybody. So what do I have to do, and what do we all have to do in order to make life a little easier?
Yeah.
Now, they're called artists, though, because they end up being mostly shielded themselves from the hard work that the heroes have to do. Like, heroes have to go to war, right? The millennials have to, quote unquote, go to war in whatever that means. And we might actually see a literal physical war breakout.
Well, we are seeing that in Europe.
That's right. Exactly. That is currently happening in parts of the world. And we'll see if like somebody, flicks that domino in order to spark something like World War III. Fingers crossed that does not happen. But the hero generation is the one that has to go like physically fight it in some way, or mimetically fight it. The artists don't have to fight it. They just have to be compliant while they watch older people deal with all of it. So artists are born during a secular crisis in winter. And then they enter young adulthood in spring in a high. And then they enter their midlife in summer during a spiritual awakening. So they end up being very influential during a spiritual awakening. And then they end up in elderhood during autumn. So they actually, in the timeline, even though they're born during rough times, they end up not really having to fight much, right? They kind of miss all the action. But they end up becoming so influenced by these time periods that they start creating art out of it. So the phrase is, they sing the songs of the heroes past. They sing the songs and they tell the stories of the heroes that came before. And you can kind of see this energy represented in this generation in Gen Z with all the technology that they make good use of. Like, this is a generation that is on TikTok that's constantly and perpetually iterating in artistic pursuits, in performance, in music, in all these different technological tools that have been given to them to be able to iterate very quickly in artistic pursuits.
Yeah, and it's a very sharing of those ideas. The last time we saw this, the generation before that would have been artists was born during the Great Depression. They would have been born right in the middle of the Depression and, seeing the World War II break out in front of them. And this generation had to go through lockdown. They were locked in their homes during pandemic. I would say this generation doesn't really get a normal childhood. Something disrupts it. The Great Depression disrupted a lot of childhoods in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. They didn't get a normal experience of it. They may not have gone to school. They might have had to go work for a living for their family, because everything was in chaos and upheaval. And then World War II breaks out and keeps the chaos going.
Yeah.
This generation is very similar. They have a pandemic they had to deal with as children. They had to be locked in their homes. Like all these things, wear masks, all this stuff is not a normal cycle of life they've had to deal with very early on. And so I think what you're saying is that shapes what we're saying is that shapes how they show up to the world, the songs they sing, the art they bring forward. They can speak to a little bit of what the world was before, but also what's coming up into the future.
Yeah. And their big influence in the way that prophets, their big influence is that spiritual awakening, and they've end up very influential in like politics and religion. And then nomads end up very influential in technology and in industry. And heroes end up very influential in also politics oftentimes, but in activism and in, becoming, heroes for war and that sort of thing. The artist generation ends up becoming influential in art. Now, the previous version, we called them the silent generation, interestingly enough. And in part, they didn't take a lot of positions in politics. Now, there is some in politics, but what's fascinating is that we've never had an artist, quote unquote, of that generation, of the silent generation. We never had a president of that generation until Joe Biden. He's the first artist generation that ever became a sitting president, which is fascinating. And he's he is considered an elderly president at this point. So all of those many, many, many decades, we never had one from that generation. We've had other politicians from that generation, but never a president.
Well, they're all in the arts. I mean, just like the nomads are in technology and not government, the artists are in the arts and maybe not government.
Right.
And again, the last cycle of this, the children that were born during the Great Depression and World War II grew up and were the Bob Dylans, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Rush, like all these. Well, Rush is younger; they're probably boomers. But some of these early, the Beatniks in the 1950s.
That's right, like Jack Kerouac.
What's his name? Ginsberg. All these writers and influencers that were creating art. They kind of started to challenge this whole collectivist 1950s Red Scare movement type energy.
Right.
They're saying, wait a minute here. And they're starting to release thinking and art around this, which influenced the baby boomers and the prophets.
You got it.
Which is interesting, right? You see these cycles start to
That's
go.
Right. Which then helps spark a spiritual awakening.
Yeah.
Yep. And so these 4 generations, and then it starts over again. After the artists, then another generation of prophets is born, and the cycle begins all over again. And so you've got this 80-year saculum, approximately 80-year saculum, with 4 seasons of approximately 20 years, with 4 different generational archetypes that are born and take on these characteristics and traits based on the world events around them and how they are treated based on these world events, whether or not they're treated as precious, whether or not they're treated as inconvenient, whether or not they are told that they're supposed to save the world, whether or not they're told to be quiet and obey. They each get these sort of traits of the generation that show up, and each one of them must be represented. Right? Every single one of these generations comes with an incredibly important place in society and reminder to everybody. But what ends up happening is, just like in personality types, we end up clashing. We end up having infighting. We end up going, no, my generational ethos is the one that we're supposed to be paying attention to, not yours, forgetting that they all need to be represented. Now, we mentioned that there are certain places that these generations end up. We mentioned how there's not a lot of Gen Xers in politics. Well, right now, there's actually a lot of Gen Xers in politics, very unusually for this time period. But right now, because we're at that age, right? Xers are now in midlife, and that's the age you enter politics if you're going to oftentimes or get influence. So right now, there's a lot of influence of Gen Xers in politics. But traditionally, we're the ones who steward technology and industry. There are right now heroes that are in tech, right? But generally, they're the ones who steward culture, right? The heroism and the morale and the cultural piece of not artistic culture, but like the zeitgeist, right? What kind of people do we want to be? How are we going to go fight the wars that are important to fight? There are going to be artists that enter tech and industry and politics, but they are generally stewards of the artistic cultural influence. So there's always going to be exceptions to the rules, and there's always going to be somebody who's like, I don't identify with my culture. Of course you don't, 100%, nobody does. But there are certain things that we end up becoming stewards of based on those messages we get during those time periods in our lives. And interestingly enough, We've been here before. Carl Sagan's like, we've been here before and we'll be here again, right? And it's nice to know that we're not alone. We're part of a spiral of cycles of archetypal energies and seasons and time periods and patterns where we've been here before. We've been this way before and we'll go this way again. And it's just a time period of doing our part to steward what is important to us culturally and characteristically in our traits to get to the other side of this time period of secular crisis.
So I think this has really helped me understand where people are coming from. Like when I look at older generations, like my parents' generation, the baby boomers, prophets, archetypical prophets, it makes sense why, they speak things forth. It makes sense why they're desperate to get the ideals out. I just noticed this generation is so focused on making sure their ideals get out there in the world. It also explains things that young people do to the older generation. That thing was floating around the internet, I don't know, a couple of years ago, like, okay, boomer, very dismissive.
Right.
You could almost say, okay, prophet, that's what you're saying. Like you can almost hear the archetypical generational dismissal. Like you're just a prophet. You're just speaking stuff. Just, okay, whatever you're saying there, like we're talking about real stuff here, but you're just saying stuff.
Well, and also your time period is done.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's a sentiment of that. Now, I mean, it's really sad because we have lessons to learn from every generation. We have lessons to learn from every saculum. We should not be ignoring and neglecting older generations because they don't feel relevant. But there is a sense that like that's the saculum that's closing down. And there's a new saculum that is actually on the rise or we're about to enter. And that's the important stuff to younger generations.
And so what's happening in this total wartime period of winter is the battle is, I mean, it looks physical maybe or ideological in like a visceral way. There's fighting or whatever's going on energy wise, but what's actually being evaluated is what values are we going to let die from this past saculum we just left, and what values are we either going to create new or take and put into the new saculum going forward. Like this is a reset moment, and war is often a reset moment. It's chaos and devastation, destruction. It's a forest fire that burns the ground that now new life has to spring out of. So we can see that energy. We're in this time period where there's a desperation to make sure that my values, whoever you are, is represented into the new world that's being created on the other side of all of this. And everybody's trying to fit it's like just everybody just trying to get their line items on that document or whatever, whatever's going next. It's like, it's got to be represented. And it's very desperate feeling. So we talked about this again, and we think this is a great framework for you listening. But what's coming up for you as you listen to this? Are you identifying yourself in some of these generational energies? Which generation do you identify with from, the time period you were born and some of the energies? Maybe you identify with the generation you weren't born in. Maybe you identify with a very different generation, which happens sometimes. We have different energies. These aren't just cut and dry energy archetypes, I guess. They're all over the place. So which ones do you identify with? What's coming up for you as we talk about this? Can you see the usefulness or the utility in seeing a little bit of the perspective, the archetypal energy of a generation? And we'd love to hear from you, your comments, your questions, more importantly, your story. If you have a story you'd like to share, maybe about generational conflict or generational reconciliation or understanding where people of different generations are coming from. That's really what the goal of this conversation is to create understanding and awareness around these things. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story. Make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We also have a video podcast. It's on YouTube. Go ahead and click like, subscribe, and that little bell that lets you know when the new video comes out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it in all major book retailers. And if you leave a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have a suite of programs that is designed to help you figure yourself out, figure out where you fit in this big old world, and really focus on becoming the best version of yourself in whatever way what that means for you as a person, as an individual. So I highly recommend checking out our owner's manuals for your personality type. It goes through not only information about your personality type, but also some of the phenomena that show up, like things like how you get in a flow state. What are called loops and grips, which are elements of your personality that might hijack you. And it really creates a fantastic owner's manual for who you are, or at least get you started on creating your own owner's manual. So head over to personalityhacker.com and check out the owner's manual that is designed for your best fit type.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.